So, good afternoon, friends. It's a big pleasure to be here at JIS. It's also my hometown, Kolkata, so it's a special pleasure to be here to see all of you. So, the reason I wanted to give this talk is because this is actually something that is important to understand. Now, in recent years, you may have seen that there has been a lot of debate about the nature of our nationhood. And this goes to the crux of what that you are seeing around you. See, as we speak, India is the world's third largest economy. We are the world's fastest growing economy. In the next 18 months alone, we are likely to go first past Germany and then past Japan to become the world's third largest economy. So we are now the fifth largest economy. Within 3 years, we will be the world's third largest economy. Now, this is, of course, much debated in the newspapers, so not telling you anything really new. But the important part here is that you realize that we are not just building an economy. We are actually rebuilding a civilization. And it is very important that all of you understand what we are trying to do, because we are actually trying to build a civilizational nation that has been in decline for thousands of years, but is now, after a long, long time, trying to regain its place and rightful place in the world. But in order to understand this, you need to first understand what on earth it is that this nation is all about. So what I'm going to do in the next 45 minutes or so is to show you what is Bharat, that is India. Where did this name come from? Who are we as a people? What is the basis of our understanding of ourselves as a people? So let us get going at all. So the question is, why are we having to bother to do this here in the year 2024? Why do we need to even make the case that we are a people? And the reason for that is that, unfortunately, a lot of our intellectual space still is infected with a colonial era idea that somehow India is just a random geography, that we are just a collection of disparate states, and that we are actually not a people at all or a nation at all. And this happens because during the colonial period, you had repeated denials of us as being a civilization. So you, for example, had John Strachey, the Viceroy of India in 1872, who says that first and most essential thing to learn about India is that there is not and never was an India. Similarly, you have Winston Churchill, who says, India is a geographical term. It's no more united a nation than the equator. So the point is, there has been a long effort to deny the fact that we are a civilization and a nation. And it's obvious that there is obviously a lot of disagreement with it. The dogs, for example, don't seem to agree with me. But the fact is that there is a need to tell every generation the story of what makes us a people. So let's go back to the very beginning. So where does the word Bharata come from? And the earliest mention of the word Bharata comes from the Rig Veda, which is a text, as you know, which is about from the Bronze Age. There's a debate about how old it is. It's at least 4,000 years old. My sense it is about 6,000 years old text. And this text mentions a tribe in Haryana called the Bharata or Trutsu tribe. It had two names, the Bharata tribe and the Trutsu tribe. And it's a tribe which lived along a river called the Saraswati. Now this river does not exist anymore. It dried up a long time ago. But at that time there was this river called the Saraswati. And this river is the most important thing that is there in the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda keeps talking about the Saraswati river. Long after it has dried up, we still remember this river as the goddess of knowledge, because our civilization started on its banks. And in fact, on Saraswati Puja, even today, when you do Saraswati Puja, you will remember at the end of it you say, Bhagwati Bharati Devi Namaste. It's a memory of the Bharata tribe that lived along the banks of the Saraswati river, and that is why the river itself was called Bharati. And it's mentioned numerous times. It's called the mother of rivers. It's mentioned 72 times in the Rig Veda. In fact, it's mentioned much more than any other river, whether the Ganga or any other river. So, the question is, where was this river? Because after all, this river does not exist today. And very often, colonial historians and others as well, Marxist historians, for example, keep saying that this is actually a mythical river, that this river never existed. But the Rig Veda itself tells us where it is. It's not in Central Asia. It's right here where it is. So there is something called the Nadi Stuti Suktam in the Rig Veda, and I'm mentioning this here, and I've given exactly in my presentation the exact hymn, the line, exactly where it is, where it states. There is a hymn which enumerates all our rivers from east to west. It goes Ganga, Yamuna, Saraswati, Shrutudru, which is the Sutlej, Parushni, which is the Ravi, Ashkini, Chenab, and so on. Now, why is this important? It's important because this river clearly lies between the Yamuna and the Sutlej. So one thing we know, that this river, when it flowed, the Saraswati, was between the Yamuna and the Sutlej. We also know one more thing about it, which is that it flowed from the mountains, the Himalayas, to the ocean. Now the problem is there is no such river today in that area. But the question is, was there thousands of years ago a river like this? And it turns out there was. So if you can see, if you turn the next slide, that there was indeed such a river. You can see the green lines. That is the dry riverbed of a river called the Ghaggar. And the Ghaggar, which still exists, and you can see that on Google satellite maps, by the way, itself, after monsoons flows even today up to Rajasthan. So it flows out of the Shivalik hills, which are the foothills of the Himalayas, through today's Haryana into northern Rajasthan, into Pakistan, and back out into what is today the Run of Kutch, which was originally the estuary of this river, which is, if you know where the Run of Kutch is, it's these salt flats. But it wasn't the salt flats 5,000-6,000 years ago. 5,000-6,000 years ago, the Run of Kutch looked like the Sundarbans. And this whole area was wet. So you had here large numbers of cities. Today we have a desert in this area, but there were large numbers of cities. And you can see most of what you know as the Harappan cities are actually along the dry riverbed. And you can see the Harappan sites are not along the Indus. They're actually along this dry riverbed. And about 2000 BC, which is 4,000 years ago, there was a major climatic change and this river dried up. And this is also mentioned in our sacred texts, that this river dried up 4,000 years ago. Next slide, please. So the question arises, why is this river, why am I going on about this river? Why is this important to the Bharatas? The reason is that there was a tribe that lived over here called the Bharatas, and they knew their land as the land of 7 rivers. This is the first and original name by which the Bharatas called their civilization. It was called Sapta Sindhu, land of 7 rivers. So where were these 7 rivers? Now somebody may think that this includes the rivers of Punjab, and includes the Saraswati and Sindhu and so on. But we know that all these rivers used to flow into the Saraswati. So it is definitely not the rivers of Punjab and so on. In fact, the Rig Veda mentions that all these rivers came together and they flowed into the 7th with copious milk. So we know that these were all tributaries of the Saraswati. Now we move to the next slide. And it also we know that Balram in the Mahabharata, he went for a tirth. He actually didn't participate in the Kurukshetra war. He participated in a pilgrimage. And he tells us that he went and visited these 7 Saraswatis. And we know their names. They were the Suparva, the Kanchanakshi, the Vishala, Manorama, Oghavati, Surenu, and so on. These are not the 5 rivers of Punjab. This is not the Sindhu. These are very small rivers, and they all flowed into the Saraswati. So basically, we are dealing with a very small area in Haryana. Now, why are we so excited about this place in Haryana? So this is why you need to move to the next slide and tell you. This is because of the very first event, political event we know of India's history, and it is mentioned very clearly in the Rig Veda, which is the Battle of 10 Kings. So what happens in the Battle of 10 Kings? What happens is that there is a king called Sudas. He is the chief of the Bharata tribe, and he and Rishi Vishishta are attacked by a coalition of 10 tribes from the west. And there is a big battle between the Bharatas and these 10 tribes on the banks of the Ravi, which is probably somewhere near Lahore. And in this big battle of 10 kings, the Bharatas completely destroy the 10 tribes. We have this description of how these 10 tribes are defeated. Their troops, 6,066, are drowned in the Ravi as they try to escape. So this is the first important political event that we know in our history. It's the Battle of 10 Kings, and this tribe, Haryanavi tribe called the Bharatas, win. Then what happens is Sudas turns eastward and he defeats another chieftain somewhere on Yamuna called Bheda, and he creates India's first empire, and he conducts the Ashwamedha Yagya. And as a result of the Ashwamedha Yagya, he is declared the Chakravartin. So what is the Chakravartin? He is a monarch who can drive his chariots in any direction. And his symbol is the wheel. It's still there on our flag, right? The wheel. So the Sudas is actually the founder of our civilizational nation. Nobody even knows about him, but he is the founder of our civilizational nation. But this is not the reason the Bharatas became the name by which we all come to know ourselves. It's not because of his victories. It's because of what he did next. And to understand that, we need to move on to what happens immediately afterwards. You see, immediately after defeating a whole bunch of tribes in the ancient times, but even today, the tribe would say, look, my gods are more strong than your gods. So you must worship my gods, right? Typical thing to happen. But having won the Battle of 10 Kings, the Bharatas did something absolutely unique. So what they did is, instead of imposing their gods on everybody else, what the Bharatas did is they called all the rishis and wise people of all the tribes, and they asked all these tribes to sit together, and they compiled all their ideas, all their thoughts, all their rishis were brought together, and what they did is they compiled all of this into a compilation that we know today as the Vedas. So the Vedas are not the thoughts of the Bharatas alone. It is the thoughts of all the tribes that they had defeated also. Now this is quite a unique idea, because effectively what they were saying, and this is there in the last chant of the Rig Veda, which goes as follows. It says, assemble together, speak together, let your minds be of one accord. Let all the ancient gods take their rightful place around the fire. Their place is common, common the assembly, common the mind, so be your mind united. A common purpose do I lay before you, united in your resolve, and so on it goes on. So basically what it is doing is quite unique. It is bringing together around the sacrificial fire and giving every god, including the gods of the defeated tribes, a place along the sacrificial fire. Now this is very important. It's a unique idea. And this idea of assimilation as opposed to imposition is the starting point of Bharatiya civilization. So it is a very powerful idea. So powerful that this idea then begins to spread. It spreads eastward, it spreads to the south, and more tribes say that we will sign up to this idea. And the Bharata says, okay, your gods too have a place around the sacrificial fire. This is effectively our civilizational contract. Okay, so I am not from Haryana. Most of you are not from Haryana. So why is it today that we call ourselves Bharatiya? Because a long time ago, my forefathers must have been signed up to this idea. They said, okay, we'll contribute our gods to this pool, and we'll accept everybody else's gods. So I'm Bengali. I'm assuming that my forefathers were also worshipping Kali and Durga and so on. And so they must have said, okay, here are Kali and Durga to the pool. And it became a part of the wider pool that came to be called Sanatan Dharma. Next. Now, as the idea spreads, look at what happens. Remember, the original idea of Sapta Sindhu only relates to those 7 tributaries of the Saraswati in Haryana. So, very small bunch of people. Now, this idea begins to spread. So, by the Puranic period, when you talk about the Sapta Sindhu, you're talking about rivers across India. So, there is a very famous chant which goes somewhat like this. Many of you may even know it. And it is very routinely chanted before any Havan, Yagya, etc. when you do a ritual bath, which goes Gange cha Yamune chaiva Godavari Saraswati Narmade Sindhu Kaveri Jalasmin Sandanim Kuru. Basically it says Ganga, Yamuna, Godavari, O Saraswati, Narmada, Sindhu, Kaveri rivers, may all your waters come together to cleanse me. So effectively, the idea of Sapta Sindhu, the land of 7 rivers, you can see, has now spread to cover and all of India. This is how India as we know came to. So the name of Sapta Sindhu came to be across India. And of course, the Sapta Sindhu was the heartland, homeland of the Bharatas. So we all came to call ourselves the Bharatas. This is the origin of the name Bharata. Now, notice what happens if we move to the next slide. What happens by the Puranic period? But remember, by this point, thousands of years have passed since the original Rigvedic period. The Rig Vedas were maybe 6,000 years ago, that's 4000 BC. Now we have come to 500 BC, so 2,500 years later. And look at how, by this point, the word Bharata, what does it mean? So here I'm quoting from the Brahma Purana. And it says, the Varsha, which is the land, that is north of the ocean and south of the Himalayas, that is known by the name of Bharata, and there the people are known as Bharati. So you can see 2,500 years ago, which is 2,000 years, 500 years after the Rig Veda, but 2,500 before today, we already know where the Bharatiyas live. They live south of the mountains, the Himalayas, but north of the ocean, which is exactly where we are today, even today. We also know which period this thought comes from, because it tells us who our neighbors were at that time. We know that the Tibeto-Burmans lived to the east, and we know the Yavanas, who are the Greeks, lived to our west. Now, when were the Greeks living to our west? Just after Alexander's invasion. So we know that this idea that is there in the Brahma Purana is from some point in time just after Alexander's invasion. So just after Alexander's invasion, we know that our conception of India was those people who lived south of the mountains, north of the sea, and just to the east of the Greeks and west of the Kiratas, who are the Burmans. We also have descriptions of the country. I have so far described the rivers, but we also have descriptions of all the mountains in India. So again, I'm taking from the Brahma Purana. It mentions 7 mountain ranges. So just like there are 7 rivers, there are also 7 mountain ranges, and look at who they are. There's the Mahendra, which is the eastern Ghats, not far from here. Malaya, which is the southwestern Ghats, what we now know as the Nilgiris. There's the Sahya, or the Sahyadris, or the northern western Ghats. This is Maharashtra. Suktimat, which is probably the Aravalis. The Riksha, which is the Satpuras. The Vindhya, which is the eastern Himalayas. And the Pariyatra, which is the western Himalayas. Now, in case you happen to be from the northeast and you're feeling left out, notice that it says those who live in the east are the inhabitants of Kamarup, which is Assam. So again, the entire landscape of India is very clearly laid out to you. There is no doubt about what our conception of ourselves as a people are. Now somebody here, if you move to the next slide, will inevitably say, okay, but what about the people in South India? Are they different from the Vedic people? What about the Dravidians? So let me say that this whole Aryan Dravidian thing is a complete invention. There is no evidence, genetic, archaeological, textual, of any such thing as an Aryan invasion. This was completely concocted by Western scholars during the colonial period, basically to say that, look, you Indians, you're proud of your civilization. Well, even this civilization was given to you by white people who came from Central Asia. So essentially, they were justifying their own rule and saying that, look, we have conquered you, but we are here to give you a software update, so don't mind. So, what about the Dravidians? Well, here is what the Dravidians of ancient India thought about themselves. So, the most ancient Tamil literature is a collection of poetry called the Sangam literature. It comes from somewhere from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD, for a 400-year period. And this Tamil literature, the very oldest book in the Tamil literature, is called the Tolkapiyam. It's a grammatical treatise on poetry, grammar of poetry. And it comes from the 2nd century BC. And in that preface of Tolkapiyam, it gives you the first instance of a declaration of Tamil identity. This is the earliest known declaration of Tamil identity. There is no earlier one. And it states in the preface, in the virtuous Tamil speaking land that extends from Venkatam in the north to Kanyakumari, to Kumari in the south. So Kumari is Kanyakumari and Venkatam is Tirupati. It's roughly Tamil Nadu even today. Yeah. This is, as I said, the first clear declaration of Tamil identity. And in that preface, just a few lines below, it says that this identity in the wisdom of the 4 Vedas is rooted. So the earliest Tamil identity is also rooted in the Vedas. So there is no separate Tamil identity outside of the Vedas. So all this Aryan, Dravidian business is effectively nonsense. And it is not that ancient Indians forgot about the Haryanavis either. Haryana continues to be remembered in later times in, for example, the Manusmriti and so on, as the Brahmavarta, the original land of the gods. And it is the land between the Saraswati and the Drishadvati, which interestingly, by the time this is written, has also, both of them have dried up. So there is still a memory of this land which is sacred as the origin of our civilization, which is today we call Haryana. Now comes the issue that you may have heard other stories about the King Bharat. And here this is quite interesting. So although we know now that the origin of the name Bharata, comes from 6,000 years ago, from the King Sudas and the Battle of 10 Kings and so on, there is a later tradition of a King Bharat as well. And there are many stories, including in the Mahabharata and in Puranic literature, about this King Bharat, including the one in Kalidas as well. But the King Bharat, after which Bharatvarsha is supposed to be in this later tradition named, is not the son, as is mistaken very often, who is the son of Shakuntala and Dushyant, but in fact the grandson of a king called Nabhi and the son of another king called Rishabh. Now this is interesting because Rishabh was, by the way, the founder of the Jain tradition. Now what happens is that King Bharat, just like Sudas, carries out huge amounts of conquests, and then having done all these conquests, he then conducts the Rajasuya and Ashwamedha Yajna and declares himself the Chakravartin. Again, the emperor who can drive his chariot in every direction and whose symbol is the wheel. Now, this Bharat and the earlier Sudas Bharat, how they are linked is a matter of debate. We don't actually know. So it is possible that there was a second Bharat, King Bharat, after whom also Bharatvarsha is named. It is possible that many thousands of years later, Sudas was remembered as King Bharat, because remember, very often we remember kings by the name of the tribes where they remember of who they were kings. So for example, very often even in the Mahabharata, you call the princes as just Kuru. or Bharata, or even more recently you'll call the king of Udaipur just Udaipur. So it's quite possible that the king of the Bharatas was known as Bharat. We don't know the exact reason, but what we know is that the symbol of the Chakravartin, which is the wheel, then becomes the symbol of royalty in India. And it is there later on in the Mauryans, they have it in their lion capital. And it continues to today, as you know, in our national flag. Next. Now comes the issue of how is it that we ended up with the name India? Is the name India derived from the name of Sindhu River? This is actually a misconception. The earliest known use of a name for India outside of India is not as Sindhu or Sindhu River or anything like that. It is as part of Sapta Sindhu. I told you the ancient name of India, of the Bharatas, was Sapta Sindhu, the land of 7 rivers. And that is exactly what the Persians called us. Except they changed the word because they did not have the letter Sa in their name, they had Her. In fact, even today in Assamese, the word Sa, letter Sa becomes Her. So in ancient Western Persian, the same change happened. The letter sound Sa became Her. So they used to call the India Hapta Hindu. So Sapta Sindhu became Hapta Hindu. And from Hapta Hindu, the word Hindu comes. It doesn't come from the river. It comes from the word Sapta Sindhu, from which we derive our name. And it also mentions, by the way, that in Hapta Hindu, there is a river called Harahweti, which is, of course, Saraswati. By the way, in Assamese, even today, we call it Harahweti. And interestingly, it also mentions an interesting ancient philosophical and religious dispute. Because in ancient Vedic literature, it is not clear that the Devas are good and the Asuras are bad. They are actually both two different sets of deities who are in some tension with each other, a bit of like yin and yang in Chinese philosophy. And so what happens is you have the Devas and the Asuras both worshipped in the original Vedic literature. So for example, the god Varuna, Rudra, these are actually all Asuras. And they are worshipped just like the Devas are worshipped, like Indra is worshipped. But in later times, there is obviously some conflict. And so what happens in India is the Devas come out looking good and the Asuras have got some negative connotation that happens by later literature. But the exact opposite happens in Iran. So in Iran, the Devas begin to be seen as evil. And their god, the great god, is known as Ahura Mazda or the Asura Mazda. And so even today, the Zoroastrians, who are the remnants of ancient Iranians, still worship Ahura Mazda. That is their great god. But he is actually an Asura. Anyway, we'll now move into the foreign descriptions of India after the ancient period. And you can see that if you go eastward and westward, there is some differences. So I told you that the word for, if you went west from India, the word became Hindu from Sapta Sindhu. Now Hindu became Indu or Indoi or Indica among the Greeks, and that's why we get the name India. It's a very ancient name. Not as ancient as the name Bharata, but it's a very ancient name. And if you went eastward, the word went from Sindhu to Yandu, Kiangzu. These are the names that the Chinese had for us. Eventually it became Shinto. And in fact, the Japanese have two religions. One is Buddhism, the other is Shintoism. And Shintoism is derived directly from Hinduism. The same word. It's just that they pronounce Hindu as Shinto. It's the same word. So the word Sapta Sindhu is clearly important. And much later, medieval Arabs call us Al-Hind. And you have Al-Biruni and others writing books about Al-Hind. But what is important that throughout this period, people realize that they're all separate kingdoms, but these people are a civilization. There's something uniting these people. And this is not debated by any of these people. The Greeks accept that there may be many kingdoms in India, but they have a civilizational nationhood, a civilization sense of themselves. This is also something that Al-Biruni writes 1,000 years ago. So the idea that we think of ourselves as a civilization is not new. If we now move into the next slide, this shows through in many, many things, even in medieval India. So I talked about very ancient India, then I talked about Puranic ancient India. Now I've come to medieval India. And in medieval India, you see, we continue to have this idea of Shakti Pithas. Now look at where all the Shakti Pithas are. There's a concentration in the east, Bengal and Assam and etc. There is obviously Shaktiism is very strongly practiced in this part of the country. I'm a Shakta myself. But you see, it's spread everywhere across India. It's not randomly spread. The southernmost Shakti Peeth is in Kanyakumari. The northernmost is in Pakistan-controlled Kashmir, in Sharda Peeth. The easternmost Shakti Peeth is where? It's in Tripura, Tripura Sinduri. In fact, the state of Tripura is named after it. And the westernmost is in Pakistan and Balochistan. It's Hinglaj Mata. So you can see, this is again, it's a landscape, the same Bharata landscape, south of the Himalayas, north of the ocean. And again, this idea of unity is still there. So what happens? What is the story of the Shakti Pitha? These are all the parts of the body of Mata Sati. So why are they scattered in this way? They're scattered in this way because of an interesting story. The story is that Sati was actually born as a human. And she had a father called Daksha, who was very, very unhappy that Sati married this somewhat wild god called Shiva. So Daksha decided to organize a great homa or a yagya. And in that yagya, he called all the gods, he called all the rishis, he called all the people. He also called Sati, but he did not call Shiva because he disapproved of his son-in-law. So Sati turned up and she saw that her husband had not been invited. But it was not just about his husband not being invited. Remember that contract that all the gods have a place around the fire? So this yagya had violated that contract that all the gods had a place around the fire. So in that sense, this yagya was actually already been violated. It was no longer a valid yagya. So what she does is she violates the fire and jumps into the Havan Kund and sacrifices the Havan and therefore destroys it and dies as a result. She burns to death. And then Shiva hears about this and is absolutely angry and furious about this. So he arrives at the scene, lifts her body and says that he's going to destroy the world. So what is the messaging here? The messaging here is that these conflicts between these different gods was going to destroy a civilization. It violated a civilizational contract. So it was going to lead to great destruction. So Shiva threatens to destroy the world, and Vishnu, realizing this, cuts up her body and scatters it across the landscape of India. And literally in her own body, she unites the whole country back. So this is again, in a sense, just like with the last contract of the Rig Vedic chant, this is a uniting of the sacred landscape of Bharata. Okay? This same contract, by the way, is again reiterated in many, many stories. You'll see many, many stories in India is about devotees of one god refusing to worship another god. This happens, by the way, for Holi also. Holika is all about a Shaivite not allowing his son to worship Vishnu. And that also leads to a bad outcome. And we worship Holi in the evening before Holi. There's Holika Dahan. This is also about the same idea, that all the gods have a place around the fire. So this is our civilizational contract. Now move to the next slide, please. Now, you have now come to the late medieval period and you are now in the 8th century. What does Shankaracharya do? Shankaracharya comes from southern India, southern tip of India, Kerala. And what does he do? He goes on a Digvijay Yatra across India and he debates all the great thinkers, rishis, etc. of that time. But again, notice that his travels around India are not random. They travel around in a particular shape, which is also the shape of India. And then he also sets up 4 mutts. These mutts are not random. One is in the north, it's in Badrinath. One is in the west, it's in Dwarka. One is in the east, it's in Puri. And one is in the south, Sringeri. Notice 4 cardinal places. What is it doing? Again, the same idea of uniting this national space. Over and over again, the same idea is being reiterated. Now, I want to say that now we are in the modern period, 1801. Okay? So the British told us that we had no sense of nationhood. Well, this is a declaration from Trichy in southern India by a rebel called Maradu Pandian, who had rebelled against the British. Remember, one of the first places the British conquered was in Bengal, but the other place they conquered was southern India from Madras Presidency. And there was also, just like we had a sannyasi rebellion here, they had the rebellion of the polygars. And during the rebellion, the uprising, the polygars against the East India Company, their chief, Maradu Pandian, made a declaration in Trichy in 1801. Now it is very important to read what it says. It says, to the castes and the people, the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaisyas, the Shudras and the Musalmans. This is interesting, but because by this point the Muslims were considered a part of the civilization, that in the Jambu subcontinent of Jambu Dweep is another name for Bharata, this notice is given. So it is important, this notice that the declaration of freedom that Maradu Pandian makes, he doesn't say we are making this for Trichy. He doesn't say this is for the Tamils and the Dravidians. He says it, this is for Jambu Dweepa. This is for all of India, the subcontinent. And he says, we are declaring freedom from these invading East India Company people. So it is very important that again, this ancient idea that was alive in the medieval period is again clearly there in 1801 with Maradu Pandian. And when Vivekananda goes on this trip around India, again notice he's not doing a random landscape. He's not moving around randomly wherever he wants. This is a trip that he's doing in a particular pattern. And you can see he starts in, of course, right here, Dakshineshwar. And he goes to northern India, then he goes to western India, and then he goes down all the way to southern India, to the southern tip. He goes all the way to Kanyakumari, and then on a rock out at sea, he meditates. There's still a rock temple there, if you go there in southern tip of India in Kanyakumari. So he's going to a specific place. And look at the landscape. Again, it's a very specific landscape that he's traversing in a specific way. This is again 1890 to 92. So this is a reiteration again of our sense of nationhood. So now that I've given you a very long history of this, what am I trying to say? The point I'm making is, you will see intellectuals, sometimes political leaders make statements like, there is no such thing as India, it's just a collection of states. It's not a collection of states. We have always had from a very ancient time a very strong sense of being a people. This doesn't mean that we are not evolving or that somehow we are pure. Throughout these thousands of years, we have, through invasion, through trade, through internet, we have imbibed lots of new ideas along the way. These ideas have evolved, so our sense of nationhood has evolved. But this, and the borders of modern India may indeed be modern, but the idea of our civilization is certainly very, very old. So the point is, it's an old, evolving idea. It includes in it many completely modern things. For example, cricket is today a part of our civilization. The English language in which I'm talking to you is a part of our civilization today. Tomatoes and potatoes were brought to India by the Portuguese, but they are totally part of our cuisine today. That's perfectly fine. But that doesn't mean, just because we imbibed so many things along the way from the rest of the world, that we do not have a sense of ourselves. And the founders of the Republic of India were very conscious of this. And that is why they mention it right in the beginning of our constitution. Move to the next slide. So Jawaharlal Nehru, on 15th of August 1947, what does he say? He says, the soul of a nation long suppressed finds utterance. Now his great-grandson may also question whether we are a nation or not. But the fact of the matter is that Jawaharlal Nehru said the soul of a nation, long suppressed, finds utterance. For that to happen, by the way, the soul of that nation has to exist. The nation itself has to exist, right? And that is why also in the very first line of our constitution we say, in the English version it says, India, that is Bharat, shall be a union of states, right? It is India, that is Bharat. And by the way, if you flip it in the Hindi version, it says Bharat, that is India. So both the names are valid. They are both ancient. The name Bharat is our indigenous name for ourselves. But the name India, although it's not indigenous, is very, very old, and we have used it ourselves for a very long time. So it is also valid. And we are not even unique in having two names for ourselves. There are many other countries in the world which have two names. The Japanese call themselves Japan and Nippon. The Germans have Germany and Deutschland. The Dutch call themselves Holland and Netherlands. The British have Britain and UK. So nothing very unique to us. So we also have two names, India and Bharat, and both of them are valid, and we intend to use both of them. There is no reason for there to be any controversy about why we use both these names, and they should be used interchangeably. So I hope you understand why is it that we have begun to use this name when you say the President of Bharat or the Prime Minister of Bharat, and use these much more, this name, this indigenous name of India. This is why we want to do it, because it is a very old name. It is a name of a civilization that has existed for a very long time, and we have a strong historical basis to use of this name. Move to the next slide. Now, what I am saying, these debates about the name, about our sense of nationhood, is not something that the people who wrote our constitution did not think about. They realized that at some future date, there will be some fellow who will stand up and say, it says in India, that is Bharat, is a union of states. Therefore, we are just a union of states. What is there about nationhood? So therefore, Ambedkar, in a speech to the Constituent Assembly on the 4th of November 1948, clarified very, very clearly what he meant by this statement. He says, though the country and the people may be divided into different states for the convenience of administration, and that the country is, for the convenience of administration, the country is one integral whole. Its people, a single people living under a single imperium, derived from a single source. The drafting committee thought that it is better to make it clear in the onset than to leave it to the speculation or to dispute. So this is not something that we are debating today, that suddenly Arnab Goswami needs to clarify this in a debate on his show. This was debated in the Constituent Assembly, and the Constituent Assembly was very clear what India, that is Bharat, means. With that, let me stop. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer questions if there are any.
Good afternoon, sir. I am Tanushka
Hello.
Das from Narla Institute of Technology. My question is, do you think India is undergoing a cultural and economical renaissance?
Absolutely. What do you think? I mean, just look around you. Look at the amount of economic activity that is suddenly happening. Our position in the world is suddenly changing. Now, of course, it means that we are living in a construction zone. It may not always be pleasant in terms of air quality. But the fact of the matter is that the amount of economic activity that we are now generating in just these last few years, and the amount of growth that we are now generating is almost now a sixth of the world's GDP growth. This is about the size of finally the size of our place in the world. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, take it to somebody else somewhere.
India has been exceptional to growth when it comes to GDP. How do you think India will keep up the momentum?
So first important thing to realize that there is nothing God-given about growth. Okay? There are many countries in the world. Many of them have the same demographic advantages we do. There's one right next door to the west of us. Their demographics is not that different. They are also, in fact, they are somewhat younger than we are. And yet Pakistan is a mess. So there is absolutely nothing God-given about growth, prosperity, and success. It is something that we have to make it happen. And that requires us to be single-minded about pursuing development, growth, progress. It also means that you have to keep doing reforms. And some of those reforms may not be easy. So for example, you were around just a few years ago when we introduced GST, right? Now, before we had GST, the country's tax system was an absolute mess. Every state had its own tax system. There were different tax rates in different places. If a product had to go from Mumbai to Delhi, it had to go through every state. Different taxes were paid. There was lots of scope for corruption, and all kinds of things were going on. It was actually more difficult for Mumbai to trade with Delhi than it was for Mumbai to trade with Shanghai. It was that complicated. And we knew that at some point we had to change it to a GST system. Okay? But nobody would do it, because no matter whoever did it would have a really tough time doing it. So this debate about GST was going on when I was in school. When I was your age, back in the early 90s, somebody said, no, we need to have a nationwide GST. And yet it was only in 2017 that we finally did it. And let me tell you, when we did it, we knew that for the first 6 months there would be absolute chaos. And there was, because it's a completely new system. Many of the back-end stuff that we had created, we didn't know. When you're introducing 1.4 billion people suddenly have a new tax system, there's going to be chaos. No matter what we did, when we introduced it, there would be problems. And there was, but it requires a certain level of political will to be able to stand through that cycle and take those tough decisions, even when you know a lot of the times it will go wrong. So what has happened is that we are at a time where we have a political leadership, but also we have a population that is willing to take big leaps of change. So same thing happened during COVID. We took some very difficult decisions during COVID. Keeping 1.4 billion people stuck in a lockdown for months on end is not fun. I can assure you, as the person one of the people who had to manage the system during that time, it was no fun at all. And yet both the leadership, political leadership, and the population took it. So what I'm trying to say is that the path is difficult. It will require lots of difficult reforms, sacrifices, and your generation will have to do this. My generation is doing whatever it is doing today. Maybe for another 10 years, I'll be around to take care of that. After that, you will be having to take these decisions. So what is important is that we have a generation, young people, who are willing to go out there and take risks. Whether it's entrepreneurship or policy or whatever it is.
We have become the most populous country in the world. So no country perhaps can be without any challenges. So on the other hand, we have the IoT and other technologies coming, and we have the most important, the most populous country in the world. So how to address the challenge, right? So how to address this issue?
So you're absolutely right. We are now the world's most populous country. But let me point out that the rate of our population growth has dramatically slowed. So, one of the reasons we are the most populous country in the world is also that China's population is actually now shrinking. Our population is still growing, but at a very relatively slow pace now. It'll keep growing for the next decade or so, 15 years, but it'll be growing at ever slower pace. But anyway, your point is well taken. What do we do with this large population? And of course, our labor force is going to keep growing for some time, another 25 years, because many of the people who are now children will be still entering the workforce. And this will happen at a time where artificial intelligence and other technologies will be there. Now, we can take two views on the matter. Either we can be fearful of technology, or we can embrace it. Now, my view is that, look, technology will happen whether we like it or not. So whether we like it or not, these changes will happen around us. If we don't embrace it, somebody else will. So the most important thing is that we need to remain open to these technological changes. we should not attempt to save jobs that are becoming outdated. Some jobs will become outdated. What we need to focus is on reskilling, on transitions, and so on. One advantage, of course, is that unlike, say, Europe, where the population is already so old that reskilling them will be very difficult, a large part of our workforce is either already in universities or will be in the university system in future. So these are not populations that have already got stuck in old technologies. So this is something that institutions like yourself have to play a major role in doing. Do not get stuck in what old curriculums are. Don't worry about what used to be taught 10 years ago or when you were in college. As a teacher, it is your job to see what is happening today, what are the possible things that are emerging, to create curriculums which fit into the jobs that are emerging today, not what used to happen 20, 30 years ago. Many of the traditional institutions will actually have great difficulty in changing their curriculums. Ironically, young institutions like GIS actually have a better chance in doing this. And I'll give you a good example of how we have done this in the past as well. In the 90s, we suddenly emerged out of thin air as a software power. Did it happen because of Delhi University? Did it happen because of presidency? No, it happened because of NIIT. Out of thin air, an institution, a network appeared. Every lane all of a sudden seemed to have an NIIT. And it is NIIT that trained all these new software engineers. So this is the game. Flexible training systems that give skills, particularly institutions like yourself, that are willing to change with the times, will actually play a very big role in skilling India for this new era that we are entering. With that, let me stop, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a long day for all of you. Thank you. Let me end by saying, Bharat Mata ki
Jai.
सही समय है